Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Technology, Media, and Telecom at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be discussing all of the various things that were going on at Mobile World Congress this year. And to dig into everything that happened in Barcelona, I've got two returning guests, our Research Director, Brian Partridge, and Analyst Ian Hughes. Welcome back to both of you.
Hi.
Hey, Eric. Great to be here.
So Mobile World Congress this year. So just as a little background, Mobile World Congress is something that was really started as a mobile wireless conference, I don't know how many years ago. It was in Barcelona and has expanded to cover everything telecom and beyond. And I don't know, what was the attendance this year? Historically, it's been tens of thousands, takes over the Fira Gran Via. Barcelona is swarmed with all of the telecom and tech cognoscenti that are out there. How many people were you out there with this year?
Yeah, I think it got close to 90,000.
Wow.
Which is really a big jump from where we got to last year. And of course, the year before it was at like 20. But yeah, it felt like a pre-pandemic version of the show.
Well, right back into everything that we've been doing. Although this year, a bit of a shift in terms of what was being discussed and the presence of a large power in tech that's now descended upon telecom, which are the hyperscalers.
Yeah, there was no doubt about it. You could really feel the length of the shadow lengthening in terms of the hyperscalers and their role going forward in the mobile industry. But it was great to be back on the ground in Barcelona. It had been 3 years since we've been there, and I had personally been to the show for 10 years in a row prior to. So it just felt good to be back on the ground. The energy was good and people were back to business as usual.
Well, although I'll make the case that this has been an evolution of, not only covering telecom, but really starting to integrate all things technology in various forms. And now that we're talking about, or I was going to say now that we are talking about, we've been talking about the cloudification, the digitization, the transformation of the telecom world for probably a decade. But we're now starting to get to a point at which there is actual movement. We've moved through some of the virtualization of telecom, over the course of really the last 5 or 6 years, to now really starting to get to the point where telecom operators are really starting to think about how you integrate with cloud and what that means. And that opens up some really interesting activity. What's your take on what you saw there?
Yeah, no, you're right. The telecom industries and the cloud industries have been on a collision course for many years now, and they're really becoming entangled. And the reality of the situation, Eric, as you know, is these are two industries that I think really need each other. Of course, the telecom operators need to digitally transform because they need to get nimble and agile enough and drive enough cost out of their core network services to be able to compete in their industry and to add additional value. And of course, the public cloud providers look at the telcos as one of the last big verticals to really hold on to their workloads from the public cloud. And they see an opportunity to deliver, their underlying infrastructure for core and edge workloads for the foreseeable future. So there's a really interesting and I would say complex dance that's happening right now with amongst public cloud and the operators. And I think that this industry sort of comes together in a bit of fits and starts, where I think there has been a bit of I think it's been a little bit slow on the come, has been like, for instance, in the areas of code developing MEC or edge computing propositions. One of the ways that I started the show off personally is I moderated a panel between AWS and Verizon. Accenture, they'd been doing some work in the public and private MEC space. And while everyone is very still bullish on the long-term opportunity, I think that everyone in that conversation would admit that it's been a little rockier and a little bit more complex to start. Some of that is about the complexity of the solutions themselves, and some of it comes down to the actual business case and the drivers for investing in this type of infrastructure at this point in time.
Well, I mean, you talk about dancing and extend that dance metaphor. These are dance partners that are still a little wary of each other. And I think the telcos are concerned that the cloud providers are going to overtake them. The cloud providers, just simply don't have the level of access to wireless customer base that the telcos have. They also want to be able to court telco workloads as consumers of cloud. So they're sort of circling each other, trying to make this out. It sounds like that's where we're going.
Yeah, there's no doubt. There's a lot of that going on. And one of the areas where that's clearly happening is in the private wireless space. So we've seen hyperscalers come out with their own competitive private wireless propositions. We've seen the hyperscalers also get involved in private wireless propositions that the telcos themselves are bringing out to market. So it is that operative term of co-opetition, which is happening in spades. And in some places, in the telecom operator, the hyperscaler is really a chief competitor. And in some places, it's really a core go-to-market enabler. So that is going to be the dynamic du jour going forward. And I think it's a situation that both sides of the coin have had to deal with in other parts of their industry and their parts of their evolution. So I'm sure they're going to manage it just okay.
Well, I mean, private wireless, as you pointed out, is this interesting area. I mean, you've got Amazon offering, buy your own base station for only, was it $14,000 or something like that?
Yeah.
Now you've got your own network. But of course, it's a whole lot more complex than just sort of getting a box from Amazon and setting it up and tying things together. But yet, it's changed the conversation and enterprise expectations about how easy it is to do private wireless. And that, I think, is one of the really fascinating parts of this, which is suddenly, because these options exist, it's you got people exploring a lot of new and interesting ways to think about owning your own telco network.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And so I would give some credit to hyperscalers for bringing attention to that issue, right? Which is the big challenge with private wireless has always been about two things, really. It's been about the cost and complexity to actually deploy those types of systems, as well as the availability of spectrum. So regulators have started to address the spectrum challenge. Places like the United States, who've got CBRS, and other places around the world have democratized some mid-band spectrum for private use. But it's hyperscalers and quite frankly, other members of the IT community have said, hey, there's a different way to think about private cellular, and it can be as easy as Wi-Fi. Now, I think the reality on the ground is we haven't quite gotten there yet in terms of just hanging up some access points and then setting it and forgetting it. But that is the direction of travel for many of those in the industry. And certainly it's the marketing narrative.
I think this is one of those things that, again, it's to your point, it's yet another situation in which there isn't, reality and perception don't fully line up. The whole issue of spectrum, everybody sort of figured that unregulated spectrum, like CBRS, suddenly, pow, you don't need to actually go through the whole licensing process. You don't need to acquire spectrum. We've now got, what is effectively, in quotation marks, free. And yet, the CBRS, total capacity in CBRS is very limited. In Germany, there's industrial spectrum that's reserved that actually may be a little more capable. But nonetheless, it's still an area that you've got to shake out. You've got to see whether or not it's really fit for purpose. And the expectations are maybe getting a little bit further ahead of reality.
I would agree. And another thing I would say is an interesting take on the private sector is really this is a 4G market. Whilst everyone talks about their solution as a 5G solution, when you really dig under the covers, especially in the CBRS segment, most of what's out there is LTE. And why is that? Because the ecosystems have been mature enough to drive the cost out of the devices. And quite frankly, that kit and the performance that LTE and LTE Advanced can bring is actually good enough for most of the use cases.
You're bursting the marketing bubble, Brian. How can you do that?
I know. How dare I do it?
Well, but that's a really important point, which is really the technologies that we've got are more than adequate to be able to do the kinds of things that the people are looking for today. And yeah, of course, everything needs to have the 5G sticker on it. But there's some cost realities that are associated with this as well, that just simply make it a better choice to be able to be 5G ready as opposed to rolling out full 5G, especially when you look at IoT and a lot of those aspects.
Yeah, and Eric, this. A lot of the systems out there today can have a software path to 5G. So you get a bunch of 4G devices and a core solution, and then as 5G matures, as the costs come down, any net new additional devices can be in 5G, but you just evolve that core to support both the 4G and 5G, the hybrid environment.
Yeah, and the cost realities in that it's the end devices that a 5G version of a thing more expensive than a 4G version of it. And the 5G version today doesn't necessarily buy you really significant impacts. We'll see whether that changes down the road, especially as we start looking at some of the forward-looking pieces and you think about not only the Internet of Things, but its interaction. And Ian, that's an area where you have spent an awful lot of time and many podcast visits. But it's an area where at Mobile World Congress this year, they were talking about that next stage that we've often spoken to, which is the metaverse.
Yay! If you've used the word, I'm unleashed. So yes, as we said, Mobile World Congress was definitely almost back up to full strength. It certainly felt like it was full strength, and across all the halls, all 8 halls, which many of us crisscrossed. I think I did 9 miles a day walking around the halls. You saw the metaverse word an awful lot, even if you didn't see the metaverse, because obviously it doesn't quite exist yet. And the unusual thing was that there's obviously a lot of focus on consumer for Mobile World Congress, because it always used to be about here's the latest handset, here's the flashiest kind of application. So each stand would have some avatars wandering around something, or something virtual or something intriguing to get to. But the real guts of the metaverse was around the industrial metaverse. And we talk about industrial metaverse, enterprise and social as these spheres of the same thing. But in industrial, having huge industrial players there talking about how they are engaging with being able to 100% accurately model, or as close to 100% accurately model a whole virtual factory, a whole factory before it's built, and simulate everything about that process down to the last bolt, not just of the factory, but of the product. In this case, they were talking about cars, the entire car and all its engine parts and all its braking parts. Every spring is modeled at incredible detail in order to save money down the line, because if you know what you're going to build and you can explore it and work out the kinks in it and simulate it before you actually start digging holes in the ground and build a factory, then that's kind of completely different, isn't it, to the how do we all sit in an office and have a meeting around PowerPoint in the 3D space. It's much more robust in many ways. And it was also a heavy undertone of trying to get to the point of having standards around how all these assets work and how they all work together, which is the aspiration of the wider metaverse, to say, well, we need interoperability and we need to be able to flow from one world to another or from one place to another and take the things that we own and all those things. Here, they're talking about very expensive, high-end assets. And so you don't want to model it in one thing and then not be able to use it somewhere else. So it's really the industrial metaverse is the driving force this time round of what the metaverse is going to end up being.
Well, it's something that I think you've talked about on previous episodes, which is actually starting to make that transition, the translation into digital forms, which, if you get it right, now starts to have some very significant cost savings in terms of what you look at, not only cost savings, but risk reduction in terms of what you're about to build. But it depends upon that ecosystem of having all the models, having the digital twins that you can then bolt together to make the model. But then those individual models, the digital twins themselves, actually have a lot of intrinsic value because they're helping you plan better, reduce risk in the final product, all these kinds of things. It sounds like we've really started to hit that point of critical mass in which there are applications that really are high enough value that they're getting traction and getting put to work.
Absolutely. And as we've said before, we've had computer-aided design for a long while. So that's not that has to be invented, because these things have been, if you build a product or you build a thing, it tends to be done digitally. But it's the workflow of moving that from a static model into a dynamic kind of simulated environment that you can, say, train people and train autonomous robots in before you built the thing, or adjust and look at health and safety implications, or run lots of what if scenarios, and then also have that sat alongside and next door to you when you're actually running the thing. But there is one company that was particularly talking about treating absolutely every decision that anybody in any role makes as a what if. So if you are an engineer and you're building a board and you put an extra component on it, what does that do all the way down the line to the future of that thing, where it's going to be built in a plant, how much space the plant might need, what that might do to the supply chain. It's not just the kind of visual look of it, but it's treating every single thing as this is going to cost a lot more than you think. Whereas maybe we haven't been quite so joined up because of the various silos in all kinds of industries. But if you think everything we do, every decision you make, every letter we type, every circuit we put on, every line we draw, what implications does that have at a system level?
Every breath you take.
Absolutely. That's the one. I nearly broke into that. But there's probably copyright issues there, isn't it?
Well, I won't sing, so I think we're probably cool on that front. Well, but that's an interesting shift. And we start thinking about the decision process, all of that, the overall planning. It's a very significant shift from what has been the metaverse conversation, which has historically been, I think, what we're identifying as sort of the consumer side of things. It's the piece where I think there's been so much of the buzz and the hype. Also the place where there's been more interaction with telecom operators. In that you've got, Mark Zuckerberg at Meta calling on telecom providers to be able to provide better connectivity so that people can actually experience the metaverse effectively, to now sort of shifting this a little bit. And I guess are we at a point where there's discussion about the shift? Are these spheres operating relatively independently? I'm curious about, the telecom, both vendors and operators, thoughts about what this focus on industrial is, and do they see that same significantly integrated role on the industrial side of things that they did on the consumer side?
I would say yes, they do, because particularly in the industrial metaverse presentations and the stuff on stage that was going on, it was half OT providers, the big typical big guys, and half telco, because things like having private 5G at a factory means that that's a more efficient way to be able to, whether it's 5G or 4G, as we said before, but it's a more efficient and operationally good way of collecting the data that you need from all the IoT devices and from the machinery and from the processes, and to be able to manage that digital twin that you have and keep it in sync, so that and then do the what ifs on that, which you can then apply back. So it becomes again, it's that solid business case of, we need to know what's going on in this process, because this manufacturing process is our core business. And so we need communication from it, and we need to be able to interact with it. We need to be able to understand it. We need to be able to simulate it. We've got people and things interacting with one another all the time in that environment. How can we do that better? That's a big draw for telcos, I would say, because it is the business case for private 5G, more so than maybe dropping it in an office, which people go to less now anyway, don't they? But or then trying to do a mass public rollout, which is expensive and requires many more individuals to make decisions. Whereas if you go to a factory or a large OT company and say, we can solve this problem, can we work with you to solve this problem? Or even here's some extra applications we're bringing with us, like maybe 360 video and things like that live 360 video that you can interact with and see what's going on in a space without impacting the rest of your operation. All those things are, I would say, a big draw, which is why there was so many industrial companies there.
Interesting. And that what that winds up doing is, because you've constrained the network universe, now you've got, you're taking action in that relatively smaller sphere. The rollout, to your point, it's done in a much more localized environment. The operator isn't as broadly impacted because it's not a complete upgrade of their entire network infrastructure. And in fact, maybe opens the door for experimentation in ways that, again, are slightly lower risk because they're smaller, experimentation because you're now looking at managing some new and interesting problems, things that you could do a little differently. Brian, I'm curious, were there conversations about metaverse that you were having, discussions at your panel, things that were taking place that you heard from the operator side?
Yeah, well, I think the operators are all anticipating that they're going to have a great opportunity to monetize, both MEC instances, private and public, as well as private wireless, as a foundational platform to support some of these types of experiences. But I think to some of Ian's point there, the operators really are going to have to execute very well at ecosystem building and partnering in order to earn a seat at the table beyond just horizontal connectivity here. And because they really are, don't have a right to play per se, and with some of these industrial OT decision makers in those applications and sort of supporting those outcomes, they're pretty far removed from those, and they're going to really need to sort of build the right stack of partners and go-to-market channels to actually deliver that over time.
Well, but is it something where any of the big cloud players already have that? I mean, it maybe got a little bit more. It sounds like we're on the edge of sort of a race to that land grab of trying to get towards a sufficiently well-fleshed out ecosystem to be able to handle whichever particular industry you're looking for.
Yes, for sure. And I think some of cloud providers are doing well there in some particular verticals. But they also, you also need to keep in mind, you've got massive operational technology change agents and control point holders, companies like Siemens and Rockwell that really have, control over the processes and applications in those environments. And those are really good, strong partners as well.
Interesting. It seems like it gets us into this realm in which we're really looking to tackle a set of complicated problems that the existing big players all have strong motivations in. But when you look at MEC, the multi-access edge compute environment, now you've got something where you've got localized compute. So most of the big compute players have got some on-premise compute capability. There's connectivity that has to happen there. You've got all these different pieces, and telecom operators have got the connectivity pieces, want to be able to provide some of this, want to be able to leverage some of that dynamic and distributable capability that MEC options give them. You got a lot of people coming at this from a lot of different angles.
Yeah, you sure do. But don't forget that the operators also have those spectrum licenses, which are still gold. Even in environments and markets where some spectrum's been made available, those licensed spectrum holders, could also build a strong proposition. For instance, what Verizon will be able to do with all of its C-band holdings as those become cleared out in the next year or so. But one thing we failed to talk about, Eric, and we'd be remiss not to, is Open RAN. You and I have both worked on this topic for quite some time, and my observations on Open RAN from this year was a significant deceleration of the hype around the topic. And I think it comes down to a couple things. One is the reality that open systems at this point in time, as we sit here in 2023, just can't get there in terms of, sort of the holy trinity of performance and energy and cost. So performance, energy management, and cost, in almost all instances, that's a worse story for Open RAN than closed proprietary systems at this point. And in that way, it's very difficult to justify rolling these things out at scale.
Interesting. Well, so a quick background for our listeners. Open RAN being the Open Radio Access Network, basically that part of the telecom network. That is, it's the radio towers, it's all of that infrastructure that's actually connecting the devices and those capabilities. There's been a big move to do what is effectively open source definitions of it. And of course, the telecom operators have thought this is great because it's open source and it's free, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we could go into a whole discussion about free and open source and all the rest of that and the realities thereof. But Brian, what you're saying is that a lot of that promise, we're getting to a point at which we have all these open interfaces that now, in fact, you can bring together lots of different parts and plug them together. In the past, you'd have the radio access network equipment that was coming from a relatively small number of vendors, and basically at best maybe 3. And they did all the integration. Open RAN says now you can do all the integration. And in fact, breaking all this stuff apart is still less efficient than buying one integrated offering from any of the major traditional players, the Nokias, Ericssons, Huawei's of the world.
Yeah, and look, there's been a lot of progress here, but at the end of the day, it's still very complex to build a multi-vendor environment like this. It's difficult. It's an improving situation with things like line accelerator cards to deal with L1 processing and so forth. But it is difficult to squeeze the performance and energy efficiency off the shelf hardware as compared to what you can do with custom setups and ASICs and so forth in an appliance-based model. And we both know that sustainability has become a headline in terms of, the operators themselves in defining their sustainability objectives and green mandates and so forth, and the equipment makers in terms of the efficiency of per bit delivered of their radio access systems and core systems. So sustainability has really elevated in the past couple of years, and that's an area where ORAN really has trouble keeping up. Performance, it's maybe good enough, but certainly on the energy efficiency, it's a couple years behind.
Well, and that winds up being, as you said, another big part of this overall equation, especially as we look at increased energy consumption in 5G and concerns about what really that overall delivered power impact happens to be. Interesting.
Yep. Hey, and one back to the future topic, Eric. You'll love this one. So everywhere around the halls was the conversations about open APIs once again. And you may recall that we went through a similar hype phase back in 2012 with something called What API, which again had all the headlines at that version of Mobile World Congress. This is a really interesting area, and it's an interesting battleground that's setting up here. So the first question obviously is, okay, can this be successful? And the high level concept is essentially opening programmable elements of these next generation 5G networks and 6G and so on to developers to improve experiences. So because I can set the quality of experience to be higher, I can deliver a better multimedia experience. Or because I know what type of device this is, I'm able to deliver a better experience. And so what I would say is, do we think this can be successful? If yes, I think it's going to be because of the involvement of the hyperscalers who really sort of do the developer interaction and community building for a living. I think them getting involved is going to be, a real catalyst for success here. The operators had a lot of trouble doing it on their own, but with the hyperscalers, maybe there's going to be more of a chance for success.
Well, I mean, the whole question is can you get a sufficiently sophisticated set of consumers of those APIs to be able to leverage them and actually make it worthwhile. And as you said, the issue is that in the telco world, the whole idea of software consumption of services has still been fairly limited. When you go to the cloud side of things, that's an entirely API-based economy. It's an environment in which you've got the developer community already knows how to manage and consume APIs. Maybe that's the angle. Interesting.
Yeah, that looks like the angle. But also, we talked about these complicated co-opetition environments. Now, this is enabling that open API environment is the investment proposition why Ericsson bought Vonage. And so now Ericsson is going to want to lay claim to some of that platform opportunity and working out, how to engage the community of developers, because that's been Vonage's business. And of course, Nokia is at that table, as is Huawei. So there's going to be, another noisy part of the market, which is how are we going to actually execute on this open API vision?
Well, hey, we'll use APIs to build the metaverse. Of course.
Of course.
Full circle.
Because there's a whole other part that's kind of partnered with Mobile World Congress, which is the 4 years from now hall. So Hall 8 was full of relatively small startups, and had rather than the big flashy halls around the rest of the FIRA, they're just little booths like they're selling lemonade or something like that. But across there, the buzz in that hall, which was packed, was full of it wasn't just somebody saying here's the metaverse or anything like that, but it was full of small companies and individuals that were building really interesting things in all sorts of fields. It was fintech, it was health, it was communications and things. And they had a specific hall at the back where they had a metaverse presentation, which brought a whole load of people from all the big companies. We're going to be talking about that and theorizing about it. And it was jam-packed and nobody could get in. So it was completely oversubscribed, and loads of people piled into the 4 years from now hall and then couldn't get into the presentation because they were all chasing the metaverse word, but then seemed to stay and go around all these little companies. And there were people doing things with kind of clever image separation things to do telepresence, if you like. Loosely, people call them holograms, but it wasn't a hologram. But they were able to punch above their weight because of the ability to get so much processing power through cloud and through these other providers. And the APIs are there to do all the various things you need. So when you roll in all these telco APIs, these guys are going to be able to punch even further above their weight. And so the challenge for some of these big companies trying to do stuff is, how are these guys going to undercut them? Or are they the ones they need to go and buy? And so that's kind of part of our coverage, is trying to make sure we look at all those individual little tiny startups and see where there's maybe a trend and where there's a thing that everyone might suddenly pile into. And I love the 4 years from now hall.
Well, and that's an area where both of you are doing a lot of work with our relatively newly released metaverse coverage. But that is something that I think we're going to have to hold for a follow-on episode. So I'll hopefully take a rain check from both of you to come back to really talk about the broader metaverse coverage, because we are at time.
Yes, absolutely. We'd love that.
Of course.
Well, thank you both. This has been great, hearing what's happening at Mobile World Congress and looking at a little bit into the future, but we'll dig into this in a future episode where we'll actually talk about some of the depths of the metaverse coverage. But that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us, and thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright, Ethan Simmons, Syed Waji Abbas, and the marketing events teams, and our studio lead, Kyle Canning-Wilson. Hope you will join us for our next episode, where we're going to be talking about some macroeconomic perspectives with our ratings team, something special. So I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.